Shares of Aerostar Airlines had just plunged 40% in a matter of hours. The Wall Street trading floor was in chaos. Economic newspapers blazed red headlines across their front pages. Black CEO cancels $500 million deal. Aviation industry in shock. In a glass tower office in Chicago, Ethan Carter, 45, sat silently at a walnut desk. On his tablet screen, red numbers tumbled relentlessly while his phone rang without pause. But he did not answer. The decision had already been made. This time, justice carried a price tag of $500 million. No one in that moment thought a single seat, just one place on an airplane, could erase $500 million from a global airline. But Ethan knew, because he was the man who turned humiliation into a counter-strike. Ethan Carter was not born into privilege. He grew up on Detroit's East Side, where ambulance sirens blended with gunshots in the night. When he was only 4 years old, his father was shot dead in a corner store robbery. His young mother, Marilyn Carter, held the family together with 3 jobs: hospital cafeteria worker in the mornings, elementary school secretary in the afternoons, and office cleaner on weekends. Her hands were always rough, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Yet every evening she sat down with her son, checking each math problem. They may look down on you at first sight, but they will have to respect your mind and your work, as long as you never sell your dignity. Those words became the backbone of Ethan's life. A memory burned like a scar. At age 11, Ethan saved money from delivering newspapers to buy a calculator. The store owner, a narrow-eyed man full of suspicion, followed him around the aisles. When Ethan left with his receipt, the man grabbed him, searched his backpack, and accused him of theft. Under the stares of a gawking crowd, the boy's hands shook as he showed the receipt. No apology came, only cold silence. That night, Marilyn held her son tight. "Remember this feeling," she whispered. "One day, the same people who looked down on you will need you." 20 years later, her prophecy came true. Ethan won a full scholarship to Stanford, graduating at the top of his computer science class. But the suspicious eyes never left him. A professor glanced at his grades and asked, "Did you do this work yourself?" Classmates formed study groups and forgot to invite the only black student. Each time Ethan excelled, the silence weighed heavier than applause. When job hunting, his flawless resume was brushed aside with a vague phrase, "Not a cultural fit." Door after door closed, and Ethan realized that if he wanted to enter, he would have to build his own. He launched his startup in a cramped apartment with nothing but an old wooden desk and a second hand computer. By day, he called clients. By night, he coded until his fingertips bled. His breakthrough came when Central Trust Bank was hacked, thousands of customer accounts exposed. The giants of cybersecurity named prices that soared sky high. But Ethan called the CTO directly. "I'll fix it in half the time, at half the cost. Give me one chance." They did. And Ethan not only patched the hole, he locked down the entire system. From then on, the name Carter Global Security spread like wildfire across the industry. 15 years later, the company was worth $4.5 billion, with offices stretching from New York to London. Ethan had become a self-made billionaire. Yet through the glow of success, he kept one habit: wearing a sharp suit every time he stepped outside. not to boast, but to shield himself in a world always ready to doubt him. On his desk, among contracts worth millions, he kept a single photograph of his grandfather, Samuel Carter, in World War II uniform. The man who fought for his country, only to return and be refused service at a diner. Every time Ethan looked at the picture, he remembered, dignity is never negotiable. And now, before boarding a flight to Atlanta, Ethan had no idea that a single seat would test that philosophy one last time. A first-class seat, where he had absolute right. But because of his skin, they would try to strip it from him. And they had no idea the man they sought to humiliate was the very one holding in his hands the $500 million contract their airline was desperately begging for. Detroit in the 1980s was no place for the faint of heart. At night, the wail of police sirens sliced through the air, blending with the stray gunshots echoing from street corners. Inside a crumbling house that barely kept out the rain, young Ethan Carter learned to live with darkness and fear. His father, a grocery clerk, collapsed in a pool of blood when Ethan was just 4 years old. The news came fast and cold, ripping away his fragile childhood. From then on, Ethan's world was reduced to his mother, and the hollow absence left behind. Marilyn Carter became the sole pillar of the family. That small woman carried 3 jobs on her shoulders, serving in a hospital cafeteria at dawn, typing in an elementary school office in the afternoons, and scrubbing the floors of a law firm at night. Her hands were calloused, her nails forever stained with bleach. But no matter how exhausted she was, she always sat beside her son at night, her eyes heavy, but her voice steady. You can lose many things, Ethan, but no one has the right to take away your mind or your dignity. One winter night, that lesson carved itself into him like a scar that would never fade. At 11 years old, Ethan saved every penny from delivering newspapers, washing cars, and collecting bottles. He longed for a new calculator to keep up in math. When he entered the store, suspicious eyes tracked his every move. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man, frowned at him as if he were a petty thief. When Ethan walked out with the box and a receipt in hand, the man's rough hand suddenly clamped around his thin arm. "What's in your bag?" he barked, loud enough for the entire store to freeze. He tore through Ethan's backpack, pulling out notebooks and pencils for all to see under the curious, contemptuous stares of the crowd. Ethan's hands shook as he held out the receipt. Silence dragged on. Then the man released him without a word of apology, only cold dismissal. The boy ran home, his face streaked with tears. Marilyn gathered him into her arms, her calloused hand smoothing his tangled hair. "Remember this feeling, my son," she whispered. "One day, those who humiliate you will need you, and when that day comes, you must hold your head high, not with vengeance, but with the value you carry." That feeling followed Ethan through his school years. In class, white classmates mocked him for wearing old shirts. Some teachers forgot to call his name when dividing groups. Ethan answered with perfect grades. He quietly turned every slight into fuel. In the tiny bedroom, he labored over every math problem under the flicker of a lamp that threatened to die. Each night, when his mother returned late and weary, Ethan ran to the door with a paper marked A+, desperate to see her smile. For him, that smile was more precious than any award. One day, etched itself into his memory forever. The State Math Award. When the name Ethan Carter rang out, the entire hall turned, eyes heavy with doubt, as if the organizers had made a mistake. A teacher leaned to another and whispered, "That boy must have had help." Ethan heard every word, but he walked to the stage with straight shoulders and bright eyes. He did not need applause. He needed the truth. And the truth was that he had earned it. Through his teenage years, every step carried the weight of his mother's words. Ethan learned not just mathematics, but how to endure silence, how to swallow humiliation, how to keep pride from twisting into blind rage. Marilyn often told him, "Dignity is not something others give you. It is something you build yourself, brick by brick." Ethan remembered every word, carved them deep inside. Few in the neighborhood believed the skinny black boy would ever leave Detroit. But Ethan did. A full scholarship to Stanford was like a doorway flung wide open. The day he received the letter, he gripped it so tightly the paper crumpled, tears rolling down his cheeks. Neighbors shook their heads. He'll be back. Kids like him don't last. But Ethan knew he would not return empty. Handed. In his heart, the memory of that store, the sting of humiliation, and his mother's embrace burned like a hidden flame. A flame that would one day scorch every prejudice he was destined to face. The ivory towers of Stanford gleamed in the golden morning sun. But for Ethan Carter, it was no paradise. It was an arena. The black kid from Detroit walked into lecture halls filled with faces from powerful families. Pressed shirts, brand new laptops, sports cars lined up in the lots. Ethan had only a worn backpack, scuffed shoes, and eyes that burned with fire. In his very first week, a professor skimmed his exam, then looked up with a slight frown. "You're sure you did this on your own?" The class erupted in laughter. Ethan stayed silent, but in his mind he heard his mother's voice. "They may look down on you at first glance." He pressed his lips together and let the perfect 100 out of 100 speak for itself. 4 years later, Ethan graduated valedictorian in computer science. His name appeared on the honor board, but the handshakes were scarce. Study groups were organized, but somehow the only black student was left off the emails. When Ethan's projects outperformed everyone else's, there were murmurs of admiration, quickly followed by the silence of those who wished his success had never existed. Still, through sheer determination, Ethan walked out of Stanford's gates, convinced the world would have to open its doors. Reality struck cold. Ethan carried an impeccable resume, top grades, glowing recommendations, awards. He stepped into interviews at leading tech firms where the floors shone and recruiters greeted him with polished smiles. At first, they nodded approvingly, impressed by his record, but after the face-to-face meetings, the answers always came back eerily alike. "We don't think you're the right cultural fit." Not the right cultural fit. 4 hollow words that cloaked prejudice. Ethan knew what they meant. Their culture had no room for someone like him. After 10, 20 rejections, Ethan stood before the mirror, staring into his own weary eyes. "If this door won't open, I'll build my own." Carter Global Security was born in a cramped Chicago apartment. A battered wooden desk, a second-hand computer, and a dream to create smarter cybersecurity than any billion-dollar giant. By day he coded, by night he called. His voice grew hoarse after hundreds of calls that ended with the click of rejection. Friends mocked him. A madman in a dingy apartment, thinking he can beat billion-dollar corporations. But Ethan didn't quit. Then came opportunity. Central Trust Bank was hacked. Tens of thousands of customer accounts exposed. The news exploded across headlines. The major security firms quoted astronomical prices. Ethan picked up the phone and called the bank's CTO directly. "Give me a chance. I'll patch your entire system in half the time, for half the cost." On the other end, a scoff. "Who are you?" "Someone you've never heard of, but the only person who believes in his solution absolutely." In desperation, they agreed, and Ethan delivered. He didn't just plug the leaks. He fortified the entire system. From that moment, the name Carter Global Security spread like wildfire. 3 years later, the tiny apartment had become an office with 15 employees. By year 5, it was 100, serving clients from banks to hospitals to retail chains. By year 15, Carter Global Security had grown into a $4.5 billion empire with 2,300 employees worldwide. But Ethan never abandoned his habits, rising early, tying his tie with his own hands, staring into the mirror. The boy once accused of theft had rewritten his story. Success made some believe he was just another cold CEO obsessed with numbers. But behind the scenes, Ethan funded scholarships, summer coding camps for underprivileged kids. No one knew because he didn't seek credit. He did it to honor a promise made long ago. No one has the right to take away your mind or your dignity. Yet life has its way of testing beliefs. Ethan didn't know that on his upcoming flight to Atlanta, a single seat would trample all of those convictions once more. And this time, he was no longer the boy humiliated in a store. He was a CEO holding a $500 million contract. And Aerostar Airlines was about to learn they had picked the wrong man to underestimate. Though he sat atop a $4.5 billion empire, Ethan Carter never lived like a king. His mansion in Chicago's Gold Coast had a pool and a sweeping view of Lake Michigan, but it was no gilded palace like those of other CEOs. He still preferred to brew his own coffee in the morning, dress in a perfectly tailored suit, and drive the same luxury sedan he had purchased nearly a decade earlier. In his garage, there were no gleaming supercars, only that single vehicle, meticulously maintained, companion to countless journeys. Ethan believed that extravagance did not define a person's worth. What defined it was how he treated others, especially those who could offer him nothing in return. His only indulgence was his collection of tailored suits. Some laughed and called it vanity, but to Ethan, they were armor. In a world quick to judge by skin color, every stitch, every tie, every polished shoe was a silent declaration. I belong here. He knew better than anyone that first impressions rarely reached the mind. They stopped at the surface. So he never allowed himself to be careless. Before every meeting, he stood long before the mirror, adjusting his tie, tightening his cufflinks, whispering to himself, "They will see a man they cannot dismiss." Yet what defined Ethan was not in his wardrobe. It was in the money he never spoke of. Every year, millions from his personal wealth flowed quietly into STEM scholarships for students of color, free coding classes in poor neighborhoods, and elementary schools without computers. He secretly covered college application fees for hundreds of students he never met. Once he even bought out a failing library just so children would still have a place to read. No headlines ever mentioned it. No ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Ethan did it because he believed that if someone had once helped him escape the shadow of Detroit, it was now his duty to be that hand for the next generation. In the tech world, Ethan was known as the man of silence. He rarely gave interviews, never graced magazine covers, and showed little interest in glamorous conferences. While other CEOs fought for the spotlight, Ethan chose to step back, letting his work and numbers speak for him. He knew that words about the pain of racism seldom changed minds. But a black man leading a multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity company, signing contracts with the world's biggest banks, that was the sharpest rebuttal of all. On Ethan's desk sat one object he never moved, a photograph of his grandfather, Samuel Carter, in his World War II uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, his eyes burning with pride. That man had fought for his country, only to return and be denied the right to enter a restaurant. In the photo, Samuel stood tall, chin lifted, as if staring through the invisible barriers of history. Every morning, as Ethan walked into his office, that gaze met his, and in that fleeting moment, he felt as though it whispered, "We have come this far, my son, but the journey is not over." That was the Carter legacy. Dignity in silence, pride even when trampled. Ethan had carried that legacy to the summit of the tech world, but he did not know that fate was preparing to test it once again. A flight to Atlanta, seemingly just a step in a $500 million deal. A first-class seat, seemingly just a customer's privilege. But when Aerostar Airlines dared to place prejudice above contract, they chose the wrong man to humiliate. And within hours, the world would witness. Sometimes, a single seat can bring an entire empire to its knees. March in Chicago was still sharp with cold, the wind from Lake Michigan whistling past the glass towers. In the 42nd floor office of Carter Global Security, Ethan Carter stood by the window, eyes fixed on the rushing stream of cars below. On his desk lay a stack of documents marked with bright yellow tabs, the draft of a $500 million contract with the Department of Defense. If signed, it would be a turning point. Carter Global would no longer just be the gatekeeper for banks and retail chains. It would become a pillar of national cybersecurity, a contract that would cement the company among the untouchable giants. But Ethan knew well, skill alone was not enough. To step into the world of government contracts, he needed access to back doors, to networks that had excluded him all his life. That door had a name: Charles Whitmore, the CEO of Aerostar Airlines, a white man in his 60s, silver hair perfectly combed, a polished smile that had graced countless magazine covers. Aerostar was not just a massive commercial airline. They were one of the Pentagon's closest partners, moving personnel, equipment, and embedded in military projects across the globe. Ethan had met Charles just last week in New York. At first, he expected little more than polite small talk, but Charles, surprisingly, seemed genuinely interested. They spoke about vulnerabilities in aviation systems, about mysterious hacks that had crippled thousands of flights. Charles nodded thoughtfully, his eyes brightening as Ethan laid out solutions. Before parting, Charles shook his hand firmly, lowering his voice as if extending an opportunity. You remind me of myself 30 years ago. Sharp, hungry. Let this trip to Atlanta be the beginning of something big. Ethan had walked out of that meeting with a flicker of hope that perhaps those cold walls were finally cracking open. That morning at 5:30, the alarm buzzed softly. Ethan rose at once. He chose a charcoal Italian wool suit, pressed to perfection, paired with a deep blue tie and matching pocket square. Silver cufflinks, his mother's gift on the day the company went public, glinted under the bedroom light. On his wrist, a Swiss watch, simple yet precise. Every detail carefully chosen. For Ethan, clothing was never just fabric. It was a declaration. In a world that so often judged him first by his skin, at the very least, they could not deny the presence of a leader. At 6:30, his driver Anthony pulled up. In the car, Ethan opened his laptop and reviewed the Atlanta presentation. Clean slides, crisp graphs. He added a few notes, then sent a follow-up email to Charles Whitmore, thanking him for their meeting in New York and promising, I look forward to continuing our conversation upon my return. At 7:45, Ethan arrived at O'Hare Airport. At the first-class counter, staff smiled warmly and processed him quickly. But minutes later, the familiar wall reappeared. At the security gate, a middle-aged TSA officer waved through 3 white businessmen with barely a glance, then stopped Ethan. Random additional screening. Hands up, please. Random. Ethan had heard that word far too many times. He did not react, did not frown. He quietly lifted his arms, let the scanner sweep over every fold of fabric, watched his bag torn apart piece by piece. Behind him, a young couple whispered, Not surprising. Ethan heard it all, yet his gaze stayed calm. When he entered Aerostar's first-class lounge, the air felt colder than the air conditioning. Eyes flicked toward him, then away. A man adjusted his tie as Ethan passed. A woman clutched her purse tighter. He chose a quiet corner, ordered mineral water, opened his laptop, and went back to work. The announcement came. First, class passengers on the flight to Atlanta, please proceed to boarding. Ethan closed the laptop and stood. At the gate, the attendant scanned his ticket, met his eyes with a genuine smile, and whispered, Have a good flight, Mr. Carter. A rare warmth. Ethan nodded and stepped onto the jet bridge. Settling into seat 2A, he felt the leather cushion embrace him. It was the familiar seat of the airline's most loyal customers, where he planned to make use of the next few hours. He stowed his bag neatly, arranged his papers, and took a sip of water. In that fleeting moment, he had no idea. Within minutes, this very seat would become the eye of a storm of humiliation, injustice, and then the force that would bring down Aerostar. The Boeing 787 glowed with soft lights, the luxury of first class wrapped in a false calm. Ethan Carter settled into seat 2A, slid his briefcase beneath the seat in front of him, opened a folder of documents, and drew a deep breath. This was the seat he had paid for, a place to work in Sulans, to prepare for a $500 million deal. But the calm lasted only moments before it was torn apart. A white man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive but rumpled suit, strode into the cabin. He was Richard Wallace, a wealthy real estate developer from Atlanta. a prized client of Aerostar. Richard froze the instant he saw Ethan in seat 2A, the seat he had always considered his own. His expression darkened, as if he had caught an intruder trespassing. He marched straight to flight attendant Samantha Brooks, raising his voice loud enough for every passenger in the cabin to hear. "There's been a mistake. I always sit in seat 2A on this flight. Always." Samantha forced a polite smile and checked the tickets. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wallace, but seat 2A was reserved 3 weeks ago. Your seat is 3C, just behind it." Richard glanced at Ethan, his look a mix of surprise and disdain. Then he lowered his voice, though still loud enough to carry. "I'm sure he doesn't mind. Give him an upgrade voucher for his next flight, or a few coupons. Someone like him will be satisfied with that." The words "someone like him" landed square in Ethan's chest. He stayed silent, eyes fixed on his documents, but his hand clenched until his knuckles went white. Samantha hesitated, then called over the purser, Alan Pierce. Tall and thin, with salt and pepper hair and a world-weary face, Alan listened to Richard's complaint, then turned to Ethan. His tone was soft but edged with insinuation. "Sir, we'd like to invite you to move to business class. Spacious, comfortable, and we'll provide an upgrade voucher for your next trip." Ethan looked up, his eyes steady, his voice calm but resolute. "I purchased this seat. This is 2A on my ticket. I have work that requires privacy. I will remain here." Alan frowned slightly, then lowered his voice, though Ethan heard every word. "Perhaps you don't understand. Mr. Wallace is a diamond, tier customer. We always try to prioritize him." Ethan answered evenly, each word clear and deliberate. "I understand. And I also understand that I paid for this seat. There is no valid reason I should be asked to leave it." The air in the cabin thickened. A few passengers glanced over, their expressions caught between curiosity and discomfort. No one spoke up. Richard's patience snapped. His eyes narrowed, his voice hard. "This is ridiculous. Some people need to know their place." The words, heavy with implication, made Ethan's chest tighten. His face remained calm, but inside, old fires flared. Memories of being accused of theft, denied opportunities, judged by the color of his skin. Alan, uneasy with the tension, stepped away and returned moments later with Captain David Harlan. The silver-haired man, his bearing ex-military, entered radiating absolute authority. He did not ask if Ethan had a valid ticket. He did not request to see documents. Instead, his voice came cold, like an order. "I hear you're refusing to cooperate with the crew. This is no longer a request. You will move to business class, or you will be removed from this flight." The cabin fell silent. Ethan looked directly at the captain, his voice steady but unyielding. "I purchased this ticket. This is my seat. There is no safety reason to force me to leave. If you insist, that is discrimination." David Harlan crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. "I have full authority over seating arrangements. Choose business class or off the plane." Every eye in the cabin turned to Ethan. Some passengers looked at him as though he were the problem. Richard stood in the aisle, flushed and triumphant, certain of victory. Ethan drew a deep breath, fury rising but suppressed. He thought of the Atlanta meeting, of the $500 million deal waiting, of the thousands of employees counting on him. To be dragged from the plane would brand him in headlines as the black man who caused a disturbance. The risk was too great. He swallowed the humiliation and gave a small nod. "I'll move." David Harlan nodded faintly, as if satisfied that he had put the difficult passenger in his place. Alan signaled Samantha to escort Ethan out. As Ethan rose and gathered his briefcase, the cabin weighed heavy with silence. Richard sank proudly into seat 2A, without so much as a glance in his direction. Ethan walked down the aisle, head held high, though inside it felt as though a blade cut him with every step. In the front row sat a familiar face, Linda Graves, Aerostar's Vice President of Customer Service, who had once shaken his hand and praised him in New York. She looked up, startled, then quickly turned away, pretending not to recognize him. Ethan kept walking, past the curtain separating first class from business. Behind him, whispers cut like knives. Of course, that seat wasn't meant for him. He sat down in seat 8C, silent. Outside, the engines roared to life. But inside, a vow was forming, cold and sharp. Aerostar would pay dearly for this humiliation. The roar of the engines trembled beneath the aircraft, but for Ethan Carter, the business-class cabin felt colder than a Detroit winter. He sat motionless in seat 8C, his hands locked tightly together on his knees, every joint rigid. Just minutes earlier, in front of an entire cabin, a captain had looked at him as if he were expendable. Aerostar had chosen to protect a wealthy white VIP instead of honoring the valid ticket he had purchased. Ethan lifted his gaze, eyes drifting toward the first-class cabin beyond the heavy curtain. Behind that fabric, Richard Wallace was reclining comfortably in seat 2A, the very seat Ethan had paid for, the space meant to be his sanctuary to prepare for a $500 million meeting. Now, all that remained was humiliation. A wave of memory crashed over him. 11-year-old Ethan, trembling as he held out a receipt for a calculator in a corner store, the contempt of strangers burning into him. This time it was not an anonymous shopkeeper, but a captain and an entire airline. History had repeated itself, only the setting had changed. In his head, his mother's voice echoed, "Never sell your dignity." Yet here he was, forced to bow his head, to surrender his seat rather than be dragged off the plane. Had he just betrayed her words? Ethan gripped the armrest hard. His chest swelled, heavy with both fury and calculation. He knew one seat could not defeat him, but one cold decision could destroy Aerostar. From behind the curtain came Richard's booming laughter, each sound a knife twisting deeper. Ethan did not turn. Instead, he pulled out his phone, fingers striking the screen swiftly. A message to Naomi Ellis, Vice President of Strategy. "Urgent. Pull every case of discrimination lawsuits tied to Aerostar. I need files within the hour." No explanation was needed. Naomi would understand. Minutes later, replies poured in. 3 pending lawsuits found. Black passengers denied boarding. Multiple allegations from former employees about harassment and exclusion from promotions. Board of Directors, 100% white. No African American or Asian members. Ethan stared at the screen, every detail stoking the fire inside him. He typed again. Assemble legal team. Prepare all options for contract termination. I'll brief in detail after landing." A flight attendant in business class, Julia Mitchell, set down a glass of water gently on his tray. Her voice carried hesitation. "I'm very sorry about the mix-up earlier." Ethan raised his eyes, sharp as a blade. "It wasn't a mix-up. It was a decision. And that decision will cost." Julia froze, her face flushing red. She stepped back, saying nothing more. Through a gap in the curtain, Ethan caught the eyes of Linda Graves, Aerostar's Vice President of Customer Service. She was seated in the first row of first class, the very same executive who had shaken his hand and praised him just last week in New York when he presented his solutions to CEO Charles Whitmore. Then she had been warm, enthusiastic. Now she pretended not to know him, pretended he was just another passenger misassigned. Ethan gave a faint, bitter smile. Linda's silence was worse than Richard's open disdain. Silence was complicity. He sat straighter, opened his folder. But the words swam on the page, impossible to focus. In his mind, a plan was taking shape, cold and precise as a blade. They thought he was just another passenger. They had no idea he was the one holding their fate. Quietly, Ethan opened the internal email app, typed a subject line. "Emergency meeting, Atlanta tonight." Sent to the entire Carter Global leadership team. The aircraft shuddered as it began to taxi. Outside, the sky was a brilliant blue. Inside, in seat 8C, one man was quietly writing the end of an airline. Ethan whispered to himself, "A seat may have cost me my dignity for a few minutes, but it will cost them $500 million, maybe more. And this time, there will be no silence." The plane lifted off the ground, shuddered, then steadied at 30,000 feet. Outside the window, clouds stacked in majestic layers. In the business class cabin, soft golden light fell across indifferent faces. Ethan Carter sat upright, eyes fixed on his phone screen. He was no longer the passenger downgraded from his seat. He had returned to his true role, a strategist, a man ready to turn humiliation into counterattack. His phone buzzed constantly. Messages from Naomi Ellis poured in like rain. Aerostar is facing 3 lawsuits from black passengers removed from flights. HR files. Only 2% of senior management are people of color, no black or Asian members on the board. CEO Whitmore once told staff, "Aerostar upholds tradition. We don't change to please social trends." Ethan narrowed his eyes. Each line was another brick in the wall of indictment. He saved everything, then typed his reply. "Prepare a comprehensive report. I'll need this data for tonight's emergency meeting in Atlanta." In the row ahead, 2 flight attendants whispered behind the curtain. There was no real reason to move him. But Whitmore is Diamond Elite. The captain will always side with people like him. And the other man was black. Ethan closed his eyes, hearing every word. He no longer felt pain, only coldness, because in their careless whispers they had handed him living proof of what he had always known. Aerostar had chosen its side, and it was never his. When the flight settled, flight attendant Julia Mitchell approached with a strained smile. "Mr. Carter, the airline wishes to apologize for the incident. We'd like to offer you an upgrade voucher for your next trip." Ethan looked up, his gaze cutting through her like a blade. A voucher cannot buy back dignity. Tell your superiors this. Next time, the price will be much higher. Julia froze, lowered her head, and backed away without another word. In the front row of first class, Linda Graves, Vice President of Customer Service, tilted her head slightly toward Ethan. Their eyes met for a second before she quickly looked away, burying herself in the in-flight magazine. Ethan smirked faintly. Those who witnessed but chose silence were sometimes more contemptible than those who openly insulted. He opened his laptop and began typing a memo to the entire Carter Global Leadership Team. Subject: Emergency Meeting. Atlanta, 7 p.m. Content: Assemble legal and financial teams. Prepare options for terminating the Aerostar contract. Review replacement partners. Blue Wing Airlines. Objective: ensure a final decision within 24 hours. At the bottom, he added one final line, short but heavy with weight. Tonight, we are not only discussing contracts, we are discussing values. The plane trembled slightly, the announcement sounding that dinner service would begin. Ethan did not eat. He sat motionless, eyes distant. In his mind, his mother's voice echoed, "Never sell your dignity." Long ago, young Ethan had no choice but to stay silent and endure humiliation. Tonight, he was the man who could decide whether a global airline would lose $500 million. In that moment, he understood. This was the time to turn his mother's promise into action. The plane landed in Atlanta under the night sky. Beyond the glass, streetlights shimmered like rushing rivers of stars. At baggage claim, his phone buzzed non-stop, a call from the office of CEO Charles Whitmore. Ethan looked at the screen, then silenced it. He was not ready for hollow apologies. He pulled his suitcase, stepped out of the airport where his driver was waiting. In the darkness of Atlanta, he slid into the car and opened his laptop. The emergency meeting invitation had already been sent. The leadership team was on their way to the Ritz-Carlton. Ethan told himself, "They thought they diminished me by moving my seat. They don't realize that moment will diminish their entire company." The night in Atlanta was damp, raindrops clinging to the windows of the black sedan, speeding toward downtown. Inside, Ethan Carter sat in silence, the glow of his laptop screen hardening the lines of his face. He no longer thought about the flight, no longer felt the sting of humiliation in the seat 8C. Now, all of his focus narrowed to one point: the emergency meeting that would determine the fate of Aerostar Airlines. The car stopped in front of the Ritz-Carlton. The hotel manager came out personally to greet him, his eyes carrying unease as if he knew Ethan had just stepped into the center of a storm. Inside the lobby, 4 of his closest allies were already waiting. Patricia Gomez, Chief Operating Officer, 44, her eyes sharp, the posture of someone who kept the machinery running. Derek Hahn, Chief Financial Officer, 46, clutching a tablet filled with rows of numbers. Naomi Ellis, Vice President of Strategy, 38, tired but razor-focused, hair tied neatly back, laptop always in her hands. Jordan Blake, General Counsel, 50, his serious face set above a thick binder of documents. They gathered around the long table in a private conference room, golden light falling across heavy expressions. Outside the window, Atlanta glittered with lights, but inside, The air was so thick it threatened to break. Ethan spoke first, his voice low, steady, every word deliberate. Tonight, we are not just talking about a contract. We are talking about values. Naomi opened her screen, projecting the report. 3 lawsuits from passengers over racial discrimination, 8 internal lawsuits from employees, appalling diversity figures. An image of CEO Whitmore appeared alongside his controversial remarks. The room grew heavier. Patricia leaned forward, her tone clipped. We have 3 options. 1. Continue with the contract and pretend nothing happened. 2. Sue Aerostar for discrimination. 3. Terminate the deal immediately and move to another partner. Silence hung in the air. Ethan looked at each face, then gestured for Jordan to speak. Jordan opened the binder. Legally, we are not bound yet. We have every right to withdraw. If we sue, we have grounds. But it will be costly and invite counterattacks. If we stay, we gain $500 million, but we swallow humiliation. He paused, his gaze resting on Ethan. The real question is, what do you want this company to be remembered for? Derek, the CFO, spoke in a strained voice. If we terminate, we lose $500 million over 5 years. Blue Wing Airlines is waiting, though their budget is 15% lower. Long term, we can make it up. But shareholders will ask, why throw away such a lucrative deal over a seat on a plane? Naomi's hand struck the table. It's not just a seat. It's a pattern. It's a system. If we go forward, the message to our 2,300 employees will be that profit matters more than dignity. Patricia nodded. And once employees lose faith, we lose more than 500 million. We lose the soul of the company. Ethan rose, walked to the window, and looked down at the glittering city. He saw again the image of the 11-year-old boy, trembling with a receipt in his hand, his mother scrubbing office floors with cracked hands. He saw the seat 2A stripped from him, Richard Wallace lounging smugly, Linda Graves turning away as if she did not know him. He drew a long breath, turned, his eyes blazing. When I built this company, I wrote one principle in the employee handbook. Integrity first. Integrity is not a slogan. It is a foundation. If we bow to money, then everything I built from that tiny apartment 15 years ago means nothing. His voice dropped lower, but it carried more power than ever. We will cancel the contract with Aerostar, and we will do it publicly, clearly, so the world knows. Discrimination has a price. The room was silent for a moment. Then Patricia nodded first, sharp and decisive. I support it. Naomi clenched her fist. This is the moment we rewrite our story. I support it too. Derek stared at his numbers, sighed heavily. Then slowly his eyes hardened with resolve. I'll find a way to make the shareholders understand. I'm with you. Jordan closed the binder with finality, his voice firm. Terminate the deal. I'll draft the documents tonight. Ethan sat back down, exhaling long and deep, but his eyes glowed brighter than ever. The decision was sealed. This was not merely the cancellation of a business deal. This was a declaration. He spoke softly, yet each word struck like steel. Tomorrow, Aerostar will learn one thing. Sometimes, just one stolen seat can bring down an entire empire. The next morning, the sky over Atlanta was clear. Golden sunlight pouring down on bustling streets. But inside the Department of Defense headquarters, the atmosphere was tense, as if awaiting a closed-door trial. Officials sat around a long wooden table, thick folders neatly stacked in front of them. At the head of the table, Ethan Carter entered, sharp in a grey suit, his eyes cold as steel. He showed no cracks, though the sting of humiliation from Seat 8C still echoed in his chest. Today, he was no longer the downgraded passenger. He was the CEO, holding in his hands the power to sink an entire airline. On the opposite side sat Linda Graves with Aerostar's delegation. Her face paled when she saw Ethan step in. They still thought the deal was as safe as it had been a few days earlier. They had no idea that the night before, with a single decision, Carter Global had shifted the entire playing field. Chairwoman Janet Morris spoke first. "Mr. Carter, we are eager to hear Carter Global's proposal, along with your chosen transportation partner." Linda quickly interjected, forcing a tight smile. "We at Aerostar Airlines have prepared full documentation for cooperation with Carter Global." Ethan cut her off, his voice calm yet razor-sharp. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Graves. There has been an important change. Carter Global terminated all agreements with Aerostar as of last night." The room froze. Pens halted mid-stroke. Linda shot to her feet. "What? You can't." Ethan tilted his head, his eyes piercing. "I can. And I did. Instead of Aerostar, our official partner for this project is Blue Wing Airlines." At that moment, the door opened. Angela Brooks, CEO of Blue Wing, entered with commanding presence, tall, confident, dressed in a navy suit that radiated strength. She walked directly to the table and extended her hand to Janet Morris. "Blue Wing has already prepared the infrastructure and personnel. We are fully committed to ensuring absolute safety for all transport operations of this project." Linda went pale, her face ashen. An Aerostar executive beside her trembled as he pulled out his phone, staring at the screen. Aerostar stock was already plunging as rumors spread across social media. Janet Morris studied the report Ethan handed over. The numbers were clear. Blue Wing not only matched Aerostar's technical capabilities, but exceeded them in several operational metrics. Ethan closed the point with measured calm. "Blue Wing meets every requirement. More importantly, they share with Carter Global one principle: respect for human dignity." His words struck like a hammer. Linda stammered, desperate. This was just a misunderstanding in customer service." Ethan's gaze bore into her, his voice cold. "Not a misunderstanding. A deliberate decision. And the price is $500 million. Janet Morris gave a slight nod, her eyes moving from Ethan to Angela. "In that case, we will proceed with Blue Wing. As long as the legal terms are in order, I see no obstacle." Angela smiled with confidence. "Everything is ready. Blue Wing is prepared to sign immediately." Linda faltered, nearly collapsing into her seat. The Aerostar team silently gathered their documents, knowing they had just been eliminated at the negotiation table. Outside the meeting room, the hallway erupted with media frenzy. The news spread like wildfire. Carter Global cancels contract with Aerostar, partners with Blue Wing on $500 million deal. Financial outlets exploded. The hashtag #AerostarShame shot to the top of Twitter. Insisko Saulven kept a calm, steady smile. But deep within, he knew this was more than a business victory. This was an answer to every time he had been diminished, to the 11-year-old boy trembling with a receipt in a corner store, to the man stripped of seat 2A. He had just proven. A seat may take a man's dignity for a moment, but it can also force an empire to pay with $500 million and the collapse of its reputation. The next day, the Wall Street Journal ran a bold headline: Carter Global cancels $500 million deal. Aerostar plunges 20% in a single day. The financial markets erupted like a bomb had gone off on Wall Street. Images of Aerostar CEO Charles Whitmore slipping quietly out of headquarters, avoiding reporters, became the symbol of decline. In just 24 hours, billions of dollars in market value had evaporated. In investment group chats, the phrase #AerostarShame spread like wildfire. A passenger's video showing Ethan Carter being forced out of seat 2A was shared over 1 million times. Public outrage soared. What had seemed like a small act, forcing a black passenger out of a seat he paid for, had now become a global moral test. Inside Aerostar, chaos reigned. The board of directors held emergency meetings through the night. Senior executives shouted about a crisis of trust, about shareholders in revolt. Evidence of ongoing discrimination lawsuits surfaced. The press dug deeper, and rival Blue Wing gained momentum without lifting a finger. Just 3 days later, shocking news broke. Charles Whitmore resigned as CEO, Linda Graves was suspended, and the board promised a comprehensive review of company culture. But to the market, these words were meaningless. Aerostar's stock continued to slide, losing nearly 40% of its value in a month. Meanwhile, Blue Wing Airlines soared like a rising star. News programs showed footage of CEO Angela Brooks shaking hands with Ethan after the Defense Department meeting, alongside the announcement of the $500 million alliance. Newspapers called it a historic power shift in the airline industry. Ethan remained silent before the media, issuing only one statement: "This is not about money. This is about values." The short sentence became a viral quote, printed on magazine covers and shared endlessly across social media. The domino effect rippled across the entire industry. Other airlines scrambled to hold press conferences, announcing diversity initiatives and anti-discrimination policies. They feared becoming the next Aerostar. The U.S. Department of Transportation released a statement. New regulations on passenger rights and mandatory anti-bias training for flight crews would be considered. Social activists smiled. They had been calling for this change for years, mostly ignored. Now, with one decision, Ethan Carter had forced an entire industry to move. In his Chicago office, Ethan watched quietly from a distance. On his desk still stood the photo of his grandfather in World War II uniform. Outside, Aerostar was collapsing. But to him, this was not revenge. It was a message. Patricia Gomez entered, placing a report in front of him. Aerostar has lost $12 billion in market value this quarter. Major shareholders are pushing to replace the entire leadership team. Naomi Ellis added, Blue Wing just signed 2 more contracts with major corporations, thanks to the alliance with us. The ripple effect is powerful. Ethan nodded slightly. He felt no triumph. He simply exhaled, remembering the moment he rose from seat 2A, head held high. The silence of passengers, Linda Graves turning away, Richard Wallace's smug smile. All of it had become fuel for the fire that consumed Aerostar's empire. In an internal meeting, Ethan looked directly at his team. We are not here for revenge. We are here to create consequences, so that those who come after us will not be forced to endure being diminished because of skin color or background. That is the real victory. The room fell into silence, then erupted in long, resounding applause. That day, a reporter asked him, Do you regret losing the $500 million contract with Aerostar? Ethan answered only with a faint smile. No. I signed a far bigger contract. A contract with my own conscience. 3 months passed. Chicago basked in the summer sun, the glass tower that housed Carter Global Security gleaming against the blue sky. In the top-floor office, Ethan Carter sat at his desk, reviewing the quarterly report. The numbers were clear. Profits had exceeded expectations. Stock had risen 18%. In contrast, Aerostar was still in freefall, its market value cut nearly in half, its board replaced, a new CEO scrambling to put out fires, but failing at every turn. On his desk, the photograph of his grandfather, Samuel Carter, in his World War II uniform, remained in place, beside a fresh folder. Ethan stared into those stern eyes as if in conversation. Grandfather, we've come this far, and this time, no one can turn away. Since the video of Ethan being forced out of seat 2A had gone viral, America had been shaken. It struck a collective nerve. How many had been treated as though they didn't belong in the seat they had paid for? The story was no longer just about Ethan or Aerostar. It had become a symbol. The hashtag #AerostarShame dominated for weeks. But then another hashtag emerged. #CarterStandard. People used it to describe a new expectation, that companies must be held accountable for protecting human dignity. Other airlines quickly changed their policies, adding mandatory anti-bias training, committing to transparency on diversity, and hiring more leaders of color and women. The U.S. Department of Transportation issued new passenger rights regulations, citing Ethan's case as a defining example. At an economic conference, one analyst remarked, "What decades of activism failed to accomplish, Ethan Carter achieved with a single business decision. He turned economic power into a weapon of justice." The audience rose in applause. At Carter Global, employees looked at their CEO with new eyes. They no longer saw only a technology genius, but a man who sacrificed a lucrative deal to keep a promise to himself. A young engineer whispered to a colleague, "If he was willing to lose $500 million for justice, who could doubt the values we are building here?" That pride spread through the company. Productivity soared, and job applications poured in from talented people who wanted to work for a leader with principle. One afternoon, his secretary delivered an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from a newly hired Blue Wing flight attendant. "I saw the video of you. I once thought aviation wasn't meant for people like me, but because of you, I dared to apply. Today, I wear the uniform and proudly serve passengers. Thank you for turning dignity into a standard." Ethan folded the letter and smiled. It was not a reward in money, but something far more valuable: legacy. On the day he left Chicago for an international conference, Ethan boarded a Blue Wing flight. In first class, the atmosphere felt different. Flight attendants of many backgrounds, passengers greeting one another with warm smiles. A young black flight attendant approached, eyes shining. "Mr. Carter, I just want to thank you. Because of your story, I believe I belong in this industry." Ethan clasped the young man's hand firmly, his voice low and steady. "We all have a place. Our job is to make sure no one takes it away." The plane lifted off, soaring through the clouds into the wide open sky. Ethan leaned back, gazing toward the horizon. He remembered the rejections, the professor's doubtful eyes, his mother's calloused hands, and the seat 2A that had been stripped from him. And now, he understood, humiliation can always be turned into power, as long as you are steadfast enough not to stay silent. The lesson echoed: use economic power to force those who discriminate to pay the price. Ethan Carter had proven that justice does not only live in courtrooms, but also in the decisions to reject profit in order to preserve dignity. A seat taken away may wound one person, but it can also force an entire industry to change. The story of Ethan Carter is not just about a first-class seat being taken away. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest change begins with what seems like something small. One decision to place dignity above profit can force an entire industry to bow and change. From the boy trembling as he held out a receipt in a corner store, Ethan became the man who made a billion-dollar corporation pay the price for underestimating him. More than that, he turned personal humiliation into an opportunity for millions to be treated more fairly when they take to the skies. Perhaps this is the most powerful message of all. Justice is not always delivered from a courtroom or a legislature. Sometimes justice lies in the choices we make when we are brave enough to say no. If this story resonates with you, hit like, so more people can hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss other journeys of inspiration. And leave a short comment. Dignity first, as a reminder that wherever we are, human worth must never be put up for negotiation.